Good evening. Welcome to another CAP Center event. Thank you for coming, and thanks to the many students who help out front and many people from UCSB who work behind the scenes and on the scenes to make these events happen. And I particularly want to thank Leonard Wallach. Leonard, where are you? Here's Leonard, who many of you know. Well, how about a round of applause for Leonard? Leonard has worked very hard this year for the CAP Center in the programming and in all aspects of our work, and does a great deal to connect what we're trying to do with the CAP Center with the community. And after all, that's the purpose of the CAP Center. The CAP Center is like an extension of the university to the community. We want to carry forward the kind of conversation around major issues that Walter Capps envisioned that a public university ought to be engaged in. That is, engaging issues, but in the broader public. And that's the very mission of what we are about. I also want to thank Richard Heck, my colleague, who's somewhere around here taking pictures. When he takes pictures, they just might end up on the CAP Center website. And you may want to check out the CAP Center website. It's very easy to remember it. www, you always got that, right? www.capcenter, all one word, capcenter.ucsb.edu. And check it out, and you'll see projected programs and other activities that the CAP Center is involved in. I also want to express my thanks to Don George, who's sitting down here, who's the director of the CAPS Foundation. The CAPS Center works closely with the CAPS Foundation in sponsoring an annual event at La Casa de Maria. And we're very fortunate to be somewhat co-sponsors of this event this evening. As I just said, the CAPS Center, or more appropriately the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, exist for the sake of the larger public. Walter Capps, after whom this center is named, believed in the power of dialogue, in the search for solutions to the pressing moral, ethical dilemmas of our time. I think what we try to do here in our various events is an attempt to carry forward Walter's work. And just briefly, I want to tell you about our next event. Our next event will be on February 19th here in Victoria Hall, when we have Stuart Hoover, who will address the issue of religion in the media age. Hoover is a scholar who studies how religion is transformed in the media and how media uses religion, vice versa. And just to read briefly here, it says, he'll be looking at phenomena such as the 9/11 attacks, the rise of religious identity movements worldwide, the increasing presence of religion in political discourse, and the recurrent scandals and controversies within major church bodies, and how these exemplify the recent coalescence of religion and media. I think it'll be a very fascinating evening, and I hope you'll mark that in your calendar. That's February 19th, 8 o'clock in the evening here. Now, I've told you a little bit about the mission of the CAP Center and its attempt to carry forward the work of Walter Capps. Let me also say that Walter Capps was a strong believer in the power of people to change life for the better. It was his conviction that people of differing colors, creeds, and cultures could, and indeed must, cultivate that which unites us all. Walls separating people must come down in the search for human justice and equality. To say this seems so obvious, and yet this week, when we remember the life of Martin Luther King Jr., we also know that working toward a common humanity all too often comes with a heavy price. It often comes through hardship, suffering, and sacrifice. And those who have suffered and sacrificed have taught us all a great deal about the core values which can unite us, not the least of which is the power of forgiveness. We are indeed fortunate this evening to have an outstanding scholar and public figure with us from South Africa who has been on the front lines of the racial struggles for equality in her country. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela is a psychologist at the University of Cape Town, an adjunct professor at the Unilever's Ethics Center of Natal University, senior consultant for the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. In 1996, South African President Nelson Mandela appointed her to the Human Rights Violations Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on which she served until the commission completed its inquiry in 1998. She was on an extended research fellowship at Harvard University between 1998 and 2001 and was affiliated with the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Research, the Carr Center of Human Rights Policy, and with the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. During this time, she also taught at Wellesley College, Brandeis University, and Tufts University, and led scholarly discussions dealing with the emerging field of study about racial reconciliation and the power of forgiveness after mass atrocity. The recipient of many awards, she is the author of the critically acclaimed book, A Human Being Died That Night, A South African Story of Forgiveness. In the book, she deals with the language of trauma and the power of forgiveness and apology in the aftermath of human violence. But I don't want to say any more about her book because I want her to tell us about it herself. But before she does, I do want to recognize the Faith and Politics Institute in Washington, D.C., and the CAPS Foundation, who are really responsible for having Pumla in Santa Barbara this evening. Invited by Congresswoman Capps, Pumla is here to lead a congressional retreat at La Casa de Maria Conference and Retreat Center, which is sponsored by the agencies that I just mentioned. So we at the CAPS Center are especially delighted that we can take advantage of her presence and have her speak to the larger Santa Barbara community. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and I appreciate that you could come at such a late hour in the evening to share with me and have an exchange with me. I want to first start by perhaps reiterating Clark's acknowledgement and to thank the Faith and Politics Institute as well as the CAPS Foundation. Thank you very much to you, Don. You picked me up last night at almost midnight. It was such a surprise. I was supposed to catch a cab, and there you were waiting for me, so I really appreciate that very much. And to thank Leonard for inviting me to be here tonight. It's a real privilege. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to talk a bit about the book. I was asked to talk about the book and to make some comments along the way about the field that is the field of forgiveness, which is my interest right now. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about South Africa, where I come from, just to trace the process and to make some illustrations on how we got where we are in South Africa. But first, I need to change my glasses. More than 10 years ago, in the late 1980s, South Africa was on the verge of a bloodbath. The leaders of the apartheid government and leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle faced serious challenges. Great responsibility lay on their shoulders to turn the tide of violence that was destroying lives and causing devastation in so many black communities. They rose to meet this responsibility by making a choice to dare to take the risk of trusting the power of dialogue and thus restoring hope among South Africans. Because they did the right thing for South Africans, today we can speak of South Africa as the bloodbath that didn't happen. I'd like to give a brief sketch and highlight some of the critical events I'm referring to here for the benefit of those who are not familiar with South Africa. While blacks in South Africa suffered racial discrimination and repression throughout the 20th century, these practices were only codified into law as apartheid in 1948, when the Nationalist Party came to power. The effect of apartheid was not only to legalize every imaginable form of discrimination, but also to reduce blacks to second-class citizens, even foreigners in their own land. The African National Congress, the ANC, founded in 1912, used peaceful forms of protest during the first half-century of its existence. But a remarkable event occurred that transformed the nature of the struggle. On March 21st, 1960, several thousand black people gathered in Sharpeville to protest the notorious pass law that required blacks to carry internal passports that totally regulated their lives. The police opened fire on the crowd. 69 people were killed, including 8 women and 10 children. After this shooting, Nelson Mandela announced the establishment of an armed wing of the ANC to carry out acts of sabotage. Force had to be answered with force, he said, to deal with the government's wanton killings. Mandela and his comrades went into hiding to plan sabotage operations against the government. A police raid on the ANC secret headquarters in 1963 and the long trial the following year led to life sentences for Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and 6 others, most of whom have now passed on. The government responded to Mandela's call to arms by stepping up its security apparatus, establishing the notorious Bureau of State Security, which soon became the most feared symbol of state repression. Over the next decades, more discriminatory laws were passed, and repression spun out of control. Hundreds of thousands of apartheid's opponents, black and white, were detained without trial, while thousands were severely tortured and many died in detention. State-orchestrated violence grew even further during the 1980s, when covert operations units were established in the security, police, and defense departments, which ran a network of police informants, murder squads, and scientists skilled in the art of biological warfare, all in the name of state vigilance in protecting white South Africans. South Africa saw an increase in widespread imprisonment without trial, torture by security police, mysterious deaths, disappearances of political activists, mass killings, police cover-up operations, and state control of the media. At the same time, the police were given immense powers and immunity with laws that protected them from prosecution for the human rights abuses they committed. The liberation movement stepped up its armed struggle against apartheid, which also included human rights abuses in the process. By the beginning of the 1990s, President F.W. de Klerk and his colleagues were driven to the realization that the spiral of violence was leading the country to ruin, and the international isolation was becoming too much to bear. He released Mandela from prison. A widely representative political negotiations team, the Congress for a Democratic South Africa, was established to negotiate what amounted to the modalities of transferring power to the majority, a process that resulted in the election of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994. The political negotiations signaled the dawn of a new era. One of the issues on the negotiating table was how to confront the traumatic legacy of the apartheid era. There was the question of perpetrators, not only those who committed acts sanctioned by the government, but also those who, in the fight against apartheid, committed human rights abuses. And as in all societies that have suffered mass trauma, there were bystanders, the beneficiaries of apartheid privilege. Most important, there were victims, all of whom wanted to heal, and some of whom were even prepared to forgive. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, was established to provide a public platform for all these groups of people to try and deal with South Africa's traumatic past and to break the cycles of violence that so often repeat themselves historically. The TRC was promulgated by an Act of Parliament, the National Healing and Reconciliation Act of 1995. Its mandate was clear: to restore hope and justice in a country ravaged by years of violence, fear, hatred, and to do this not through a process of rigid justice that condemns, but through one that invites dialogue. Hatred and vengeance are easy. Feelings of hatred and revenge against those who have hurt us irreparably are easier to develop and to sustain than an attitude that seeks to engage and to maintain ongoing dialogue. One reason people hold on to hatred is to distance themselves from those responsible for their pain. They are afraid that if they engage them as real people, instead of the evil monsters they perceive them to be, then they will be compromising their moral stance and lowering the entry requirements into the human community. There is another reason why people want to keep a distance from those who commit horrible deeds, and that is the fear of discovering that perpetrators of politically motivated atrocities are as human as they are. Confining to the realm of the evil those whose politics inspired them to perpetrate terrible acts excuses them, I think, and dismisses them into the category of the hopelessly, radically other. Sustained, engaged, ordered dialogue, however, forces perpetrators to unearth what moral sensibilities they have buried and to face what they have done in the sobering atmosphere of reflection upon and consideration of the destruction they have caused. While dialogue may not resolve every problem in a society in transition from mass brutality, it does create avenues for broadening our models of justice and for healing deep fractures in a nation by encouraging acknowledgement of moral responsibility and accountability. This idea was the starting point that led to the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Rather than pursue the divisions of the past, South African leaders from both sides of the political spectrum made a choice to pursue a united vision that led on the road of shared humanity ahead. In this presentation tonight, I would like to draw from my book, A Human Being Died That Night, to illustrate how the spirit of dialogue was extended beyond those in leadership, allowing South Africans to make the invisible visible by finding language to talk about the past through the stories of pain brought on the TRC and experienced vicariously by those who witnessed the TRC hearings, permeating public discussion of the past. Let me begin by shedding some light on the man I interviewed and discussed in my book, Eugene de Kock. Eugene de Kock was the head of the Covert Operations Unit of the apartheid government's security department. In South Africa, he is known by his nickname, Prime Evil, the embodiment of all that was evil about apartheid. He was granted amnesty for most of the crimes he committed, but refused amnesty for one of the crimes for which he is serving a life sentence, so he couldn't be released. My interviews with Eugene de Kock began following his first appearance before the TRC. He was giving testimony about his role in a bombing incident in which 3 black policemen were killed to prevent them from revealing the identity of the white policemen who had murdered 4 well-known activists. De Kock, on orders from a police general, gave instructions for the building of the bomb that killed the 3 policemen by remote control. At the end of the TRC hearing, de Kock asked to meet privately with the widows of the men killed in the incident. Not only did the widows agree to meet with him, they also offered him the forgiveness he wanted. Explaining her reasons for granting de Kock forgiveness, one of the widows said, quote, "I was profoundly touched by him. I didn't even look at him when he was speaking to us. I don't think I looked at him. At least I don't remember looking at him in that room. Yet I felt the genuineness in his apology. I couldn't control my tears. I could hear him, but I was overwhelmed with emotion, and I was just nodding as a way of saying, yes, I forgive you." I hope that when de Kock sees our tears, he knows that they are not only tears for our husbands, but tears for him as well. I would like to hold him by the hand and show him that there is a future and that he can still change. It may be difficult to comprehend how such a statement of forgiveness is humanly possible. More challenging is to understand the process involved in forgiveness. There are certain basic elements that are common in most acts of forgiveness: acknowledgement of wrongdoing, contrition, apology, and remorse. All are necessary for forgiveness to happen. But I think that crucial among these elements are expressions of remorse. The pain of remorse, as I'd like to call it, humanizes a perpetrator. And it is this human moment that draws the victim towards him and evokes the victim's empathy. The feeling of remorse represents the perpetrator's desire to undo the deed and to be cleansed of it. The victim's forgiveness provides a symbolic form of the cleansing that the perpetrator so desperately needs. Hannah Arendt writes that radically evil acts, quote, transcend the realm of human affairs, unquote, and are therefore neither punishable nor forgivable. The radically evil are unpunishable because no amount of punishment can balance what they have done. They are unforgivable because no yardstick exists by which we can measure what it means to forgive them, and there is no mental disposition we can adopt towards them that would correct the sense of injustice that their actions have brought into our world. There may be some deeds for which the language of apology and forgiveness may be entirely inappropriate. However, to exclude all horrible acts committed with a political motive from the realm of the forgivable does not capture the complexities of the social context within which gross evil occurs. Societies like South Africa and Rwanda, for example, have found it more constructive to focus on creating and nurturing the conditions that make forgiveness first conceivable, then ultimately possible. In these two societies, the language of reconciliation and restorative justice has defined and continued to define the process of dealing with the past. After my interviews with the widows who had granted Eugene de Kock forgiveness, I went to interview de Kock at the maximum section of Pretoria Prison, where he is serving his sentence, to understand more about his apology and to see for myself if he were deserving of the forgiveness the widows had granted him. De Kock described his first appearance before the TRC as an experience that had left him feeling as if a heavy burden had been removed from his shoulders. When I asked him to tell me about the meeting with the widows, with the widows of his victims, his face dropped and he became visibly distressed. I could hear the clatter of his leg chains as he shuffled his feet. Sitting directly from me in the small prison consulting room, his heavy glasses on the table that separated us, he started to speak. There were tears in his eyes. In a breaking voice, he said, "I wish I could do much more than I'm sorry. I wish there was a way of bringing their bodies back alive. I wish I could say, 'Here are your husbands,'" he said, stretching out his arms as if bearing an invisible body, his hands trembling, his mouth quivering. "But unfortunately," he said, "I have to live with it." Relating to him the only way one does in such human circumstances, I touched his shaking hand, surprising myself. Then I pulled back and for a moment recast my spontaneous act of reaching out as something incompatible with the circumstances of an encounter with a person who, not too long ago, used these same hands, the same voice, to authorize and trigger unspeakable acts of malice against people very much like myself. In the couple of weeks after my visit with de Kock, I was tormented by questions of whether I had crossed the moral line, whether I had betrayed my people and the many victims killed by de Kock, and whether I was guilty of feeling empathy for him. I felt ashamed that I had allowed myself to feel sorry for him, and angry that he was both the person who had done these horrible things and the person whose human vulnerability I had encountered in his prison cell. I had seen two sides of de Kock, one evil and the other, the one I was afraid of confronting, a human being capable of feeling, crying, and knowing the pain. In a moment of empathy, we shared a common idiom of humanity. In touching de Kock's hand, it seemed I had touched his leprosy. I had engaged a man who still carried his evil with him. When I woke up the morning after my interview with him, I couldn't lift my right hand with which I had reached out to touch him. For a long, anxious moment, I had lost the function of my hand. It felt numb. I could no longer feel with it. In a sense, my hand had lost its essence, and by extension, the essence of what it is to be human. The words of the psalmist offer a powerful metaphor. Quote, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning," unquote. Had I wasted the gift of compassion on someone who was not worthy of it? And here lies the challenge. When perpetrators let go of their rationalizations and are no longer blaming obedience to authority to justify their actions, when they begin to acknowledge wrongdoing and show contrition, remorse, when they are begging to rejoin the world of moral humanity, what should our response be? Should we reject their pleas and continue to punish them with our hatred? Or should we extend our compassion and invite them to journey with us on the road of moral humanity? Ordinary people, under certain circumstances, are capable of far greater evil than we could have imagined, as the stories on the TRC illustrate. But so are we capable of far greater virtue than we might have thought. To paraphrase Walter Capps, our humanity is strongest when we are directed by that which unites us as human beings, compassion and an ethos of care, even for our enemies, rather than giving in to fears, suspicions, and paranoias. Is it possible to truly connect at a human level with a person who has committed indescribable crimes? How can we extend our compassion to people who are responsible for unspeakable deeds in society? At the same time, how can we not, when their hearts are bleeding, when at last their conscience speaks? The widows who reached out with forgiveness to de Kock were responding not to the evil de Kock, but to the human being they discovered in his cry for understanding and forgiveness, his expression of remorse. In the isolation of his cell, abandoned by his immediate superiors and those who crafted the laws that supported his evil operations, a different truth was revealed to de Kock. Now he was alone with his conscience, and his conscience spoke to him in clear language. If I had any doubt that de Kock was troubled and remorseful about his past, the penultimate interview with him laid my doubts to rest. As I was collecting my belongings to leave at the end of this interview, de Kock was still lingering, which was unusual, as he normally left to be escorted back to his cell by the guards. He came over and stood in front of me, arms folded in a stiff posture, looking very tense. A heavy silence hung in the room. "Pumla," de Kock said, "I've been meaning to ask you this right from our second interview. Have I ever killed any of your friends or family?" And at this point, I'm tempted to give maybe a couple of illustrations that capture this idea of breaking down walls, the idea of making humanity meet, engage in dialogue with one another at a point, at the place of humanity, on the table of humanity. And these are drawn from testimonies before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first illustration I'd like to share with you is from a documentary that perhaps some of you have seen, A Long Night's Journey into Day. This documentary shows 4 cases of forgiveness, different kinds of forgiveness, and 1 or 2 of them, forgiveness doesn't quite happen. But the one I want to share with you is one in which forgiveness does happen. The young man who approaches the women, the mothers of 7 young men who were killed in the township of Guguletu near Cape Town, was a police collaborator. He had been sent by the security department, in fact, by the covert operations unit that was run by Eugene de Kock. This man was sent to infiltrate the township and to identify some black young activists and train them with specific firearms and then set them up for ambush. This happened indeed. They identified 7 young men. They provided them with firearms that were provided by the security department and trained them and identified a target that they were supposed to attack. And when they went on the attack, they were met by a crowd of policemen, and they were massacred and killed very brutally. The story, of course, that emerged was that the government security department had yet again, succeeded in thwarting a terrorist act. We never heard in those days that it was a set-up terrorist attack, but some of us knew, but there was no evidence. Now, on the stage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the story was revealed. The full story was revealed of how this black young officer who was collaborating with the police went to the community to identify these men and train them and bring them into ambush. He was now meeting the mothers at the end of his testimonies, and the mothers had agreed to meet with him. My role was to prepare the mothers, which I did for a week, as well as prepare these young men for the meeting with the mothers. Just very briefly, what happened in that meeting is that this man walks in and talks to the mothers and tells them how sorry he was that he had been involved in this operation. The mothers are very angry, upset at first, and they express their anger, which they had throughout the week been expressing. And what I have to say here as a quick footnote is that by the time they met with this young man, the mothers were already ready to forgive this man. But meeting him for the first time, there was a lot of anger expressed. At the end of the venting of the sad emotion and painful emotions, one of the mothers speaks out and turns to this young man and says, "My child, you are the same age as my son, whom you murdered. But I want to tell you today that I forgive you. I want to tell you that as Christopher's mother, I forgive you." And each of the mothers get up to embrace this man, and each one of them says something to them, a word of forgiveness or the embrace. The moment is very electrifying, more so because we know what this young man had done. We know what these mothers had gone through, yet here they were embracing, not only saying the words of forgiveness, but going beyond the words and embracing him. The important observation that I made was in the language. The first mother who speaks with the voice of forgiveness refers to this man as my child. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit, that when forgiveness happens in these contexts, there is a humanization of both the victim and the perpetrator. The person who did the terrible deed humanizes the victim by expressing this sense of remorse, because through remorse, he is really saying, I recognize that I caused you pain. When he was committing his deed, he was obliterating the possibility that these people can experience pain. In fact, he was blinded to the pain of the victim. But now he has been reawoken to the fact that he did cause pain and is acknowledging it. And on the other side, the mothers are recognizing that act of remorse as a moment that needs to be embraced as a human moment. And it's that connection that becomes the point where this incredible story is created, a story of forgiveness. And it would not be possible were a platform never created if the agenda was to judge and to judge in a court of law and to exercise the policies of retribution. This kind of language would never have been possible. It's only through this notion, this alternative of restorative justice, that these possibilities of engagement and dialogue are created. Apartheid turned religion on its head, and through various church-based structures in the military, the police and academy, and in the church itself, provided theological vocabulary to disguise the naked evil of what was going on under apartheid. The Bible that was issued to young white men in the army had a message from the former president P.W. Botha on its first page, not an insert, the first page of the Bible, and it read, quote, "This Bible is an important part of your calling to duty. When you are overwhelmed with doubt, pain, or when you find yourself wavering, you must turn to this wonderful book for answers. You are now called to play your part in defending our country. It is my prayer that this Bible will be your comfort so that you can fulfill your duty, and South Africa and her people will forever be proud of you. Of all the weapons you carry, this is the greatest because it is the weapon of God," unquote. All young men in the South African army that was fighting in the black townships as well as in the borders carried this Bible. South African clergy of the Afrikaans Church and chaplains who prayed that the army defeat their enemy encouraged Eugene de Kock and many like him, in addition to the theoretical coaching that they received. Whole congregations throughout the Afrikaans Church praised them for what they were doing for their country. Voices that spoke a different language from within the church were muted. But when some of these voices rose from silence and came before the TRC, it was a sign of hope. Now, hope is not enough to bring about the transformation that makes change meaningful for people who still face poverty and unemployment in South Africa. But symbols of hope may be all that is necessary to change people's hearts. The challenge is for leaders to seize the moment of hope and translate it into lasting gains. When the Afrikaans Church appeared before the Truth Commission to apologize, it was just such a sign of hope that moved many black people who were present. It is more than a sign. Perhaps it is a sacrament for those who are apologizing, for those who are witnesses, and for those to whom the apology is directed. Bethel Muller, a professor of religion at the Afrikaans University, the University of Stellenbosch in Cape Town, was one of 3 members of the Afrikaans Church who came to apologize for the church's role in providing biblical justification for apartheid. His response to a question that I asked him about what it was like to be testifying about his role and the role of the Afrikaans Church in apartheid in furthering the aims of apartheid was as follows. Quote, "I was freed by participating in making this statement. I felt free. I became part of a process where we could tell our story. It was a privilege, but it was not easy at all because you have to look deep into your own heart and see the evil in your heart," unquote. What is the appropriate response to the despair, the pathos through which perpetrators and bystanders show their human side? How should the question of empathy be handled? If showing compassion to enemies is something that the mind repels, what can society do in order to hear perpetrators' cries for mercy? The cries that tell us that their hearts are breaking and that they are willing to denounce the past. Should society turn its back on them and hold on to hate, passing on seeds of hate to its young people and to their children? If the goal is to transform relationships in a society whose past is marked by violent conflict, how can hate be transcended? And how real can forgiveness be in the context of tragedy? Many people struggle to see the possibility of forgiveness in their lives and especially in the aftermath of traumatic event. And it's not difficult to see why people struggle with forgiveness. To maintain some sort of moral compass, to hold on to some sort of clear distinction between what is humanely depraved but conceivable and what is simply off the scale of human acceptability. There is a desire, an inward emotional and mental pressure not to forgive, as if forgiveness somehow signals acceptability, and acceptability signals some amount, however small, of condoning. Yet how do you forgive unless you can find claims of remorse credible? And how do you find them credible unless you first attempt to understand why they did it? But how do you understand when the actions that are being told are so abhorrent? There is a desire to draw a line in the sand and to say, where you have been, I cannot follow you. Your actions can never be regarded as part of what it means to be human. Yet not to forgive means closing the door to the possibility of transformation. It also means usurping the role of divine judgment. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Pumla, I think that applause speaks for itself. We not only heard you describe the power of forgiveness, I think we've seen it embodied within you, and that is indeed truly a testimony to compassion. Thank you so much. It has been a long day for her, traveling, and we're not going to stay here too long this evening, but she will agree to take a few questions. And if you have a question, we do need them asked in a microphone, and we should have some people. Here's Stephanie over here with a microphone, and here we have somebody with a microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and somebody will get to you.
Going north to Zimbabwe, What do you think about Mugabe? Mugabe is doing nothing, exactly the same as what happened in South Africa, even worse, 10 times worse. He's not only chasing the people off their farms, he's murdering them, and not only is white people, black people as well. So how come Mugabe can get away with it? There's nothing said, yet they bring all this lot up in South Africa, but Zimbabwe is 10 times worse than South Africa ever was or ever will be. What is your opinion on that?
I wouldn't go so far as to compare the two. There are similarities. You are right, I agree with you, that the brutalities that are committed in that country in a very ironic way, parallel those that have happened in other...
In other words, you don't think Mugabe is bad at all?
No, I am not saying that, sir. But what I am saying is that what I want to say about that is when we don't have a public process where victims and perpetrators can acknowledge the past and acknowledge responsibility and accountability in public, there is always a danger that yesterday's victims will become tomorrow's oppressors.
I mean, since Mugabe took over, the country has gone down, it's starving. 75% of the food was supplied by the farms. He kicks them off the farms, doesn't give them anything for them. The farmers have been there for like 100 years. Their mothers, their fathers, their grandfathers are all buried on the farm, and he just sends 1,000 Africans, and you say, right, get off, it belongs to us now. And there's nothing done about it. And they're the same terrorists what the rest of the world is fighting. The same terrorists, I know, because I fought them. Exactly the same terrorists.
It's a great challenge, and I think that the world has to speak out, including South Africa, has to speak out against atrocities, no matter where they happen.
But South Africa has been backing Zimbabwe.
Well, not South Africa. The president of South Africa has maintained an uncomfortable stance as far as the situation in Zimbabwe is concerned. I wouldn't say necessarily this is what South Africans believe in, but it's unfortunate that the president of South Africa has not been as outspoken as other parts in the world would have liked him to be open. But it's very complicated. It's not simple as we should not imagine that it is simple. The president of South Africa has got a lot of investment in the relationship with Robert Mugabe. That does not mean that he should be silent about what Mugabe is doing. There is a long history of colonialism in Zimbabwe, of black people who have suffered and had been excluded from their own land that was taken by white people. But that doesn't mean that now Mugabe should expunge white people. But it is a complicated history, and one that we really we cannot be neutral about it. But I think we have to have an open mind about what has happened in the past, and not to regard what is happening now in isolation of the oppression and repression and suffering that thousands and millions of black people suffered in Zimbabwe.
Thank you. I hope the rest of the world will look at that thing.
Yes, sir. Do we have him first? Okay. Then I'll recognize.
I'll do it. Sir.
How did you answer de Kock's final question? Did he injure one of your family?
I thought about that question, whether I should say it in this audience, but then I thought that I'd be giving away the book. If it's in the book.
That's a good answer. Yes.
Yes, welcome to Santa Barbara, sister.
Thank you.
I have a question. Have you had consultations with the Zuma Zuma Credo Mutua?
With
Zuma Zuma Credo Mutua?
Zuma Zuma Krelimotwa.
Yes.
The poet.
Well, he's the Sanusi in South Africa. He lives
Oh,
in
the
Johannesburg.
Sanusi. Oh no, I haven't. I don't know who he is.
Oh.
What is your question?
Well, I was just wondering because he's a man of great wisdom, and it seems that in the discussion of South Africa, and especially dealing with the AIDS, he's very knowledgeable and works on the etheric level with plant life that can provide cures, but his work is never talked, and matter of fact, it's suppressed. And so this is really something that's time to come out into the public, I feel.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. You and then you. Just a second.
Sawubona.
Oh, sawubona yebo.
Johnny.
Dikhona, where did you learn Zulu?
In South Africa, in
Oh.
Pietermaritzburg.
Ah.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on Saddam Hussein and the chances for reconciliation with our country and Iraq and the Iraqi people, but specifically with regard to Hussein, and can he be forgiven?
It's not an easy question, but what I can say about it is these situations, one can draw comparisons between these experiences. The lesson that I think is important, drawing from South Africa and places like Rwanda and elsewhere, that are other places that are seeking alternative ways of responding to atrocities, the lesson is that dialogue is important. Understanding and dialogue is an important starting point. Now, can we do dialogue with every perpetrator in the world? The answer is no. It really depends on the circumstances, on the situation that presents as it presents itself. People like Eugene de Kock, whom I talk about in the book, the encounters that happened between victims and perpetrators in South Africa occurred because the conditions in South Africa allowed it. South African transition process was defined in the way of engaging with others who were once former enemies. And that is what enabled people like Eugene de Kock to dig deep into their conscience and to rediscover their sense of humanity. Now, can a person like Saddam Hussein or other people like him do what happened in South Africa? Can they, in fact, be encouraged or enabled to become human, to restore their humanity? It's hard in an adversarial situation, in a process that emphasizes the adversarial mode of justice. The stance of the perpetrator is defensive. South Africa was unique in that the way that the process was defined was that perpetrators were encouraged to speak the truth. In an adversarial situation, perpetrators are encouraged to lie and to be on the defensive. Here was a process that says, we will reward you for speaking the truth, for being human, for being who you are. And that is what enabled them to, and victims as well, to engage with one another as human beings. Now, in the absence of that possibility, it really limits to a large degree any kind of growth of the human spirit. The human spirit is not present in the way that it is constructed, in the way that it is that the solutions are created. Then it's very unlikely that there can be any serious human dialogue in the way that you want to suggest. But one cannot exclude that. We saw with the at The Hague, with the trial of some of the people from the former Yugoslavia, there's a woman who said right there at the International Tribunal that I feel so ashamed to have been associated with this government. She was able to do that, but these are rare, these are rare responses. And that really, for me, is where hope lies. Because at the end of the day, we want to see that these people are human after all, that they will transform and that they will be rehabilitated, that in fact they will face their victims and say, my goodness, what destruction I caused. Now, that is what I would see as hopeful, for perpetrators to be able to face their victims and to admit the destruction that they caused, and not only admit the destruction they caused, to apologize, to say, I am sorry for having, not even apologizing to expect to be released, but just to engage with people they have hurt so brutally and so irreparably, and to restore their dignity. Because when you destroy people in the way that people like Saddam Hussein and others do, you dehumanize them, you obliterate their humanness, and they cry out. Part of the trauma is the crying out for recognition of that humanness, of their humanity, of their dignity. And when perpetrators say they apologize, they are recognizing their dignity, and they are really pulling out from the depths of the pain the sense, the feeling that the victims have been longing for, to be recognized, for their humanity to be recognized, even in death.
Yabonga.
Goes.
Let's see, do you still have your question?
There's one.
Right here, and then over here.
I want to thank you so much for coming to Santa Barbara, and I've read your book and admire it so much. The question I have is about reparations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and whether or not you were satisfied with the final outcome on that, which unfolded just last year.
Just to put some of you in the picture, the Commission had 3 committees. The Human Rights Violations Committee, that was the committee that organized public hearings for victims. The Amnesty Committee, that was the committee that was given the powers to grant amnesty on certain conditions, like full disclosure, the proportionality of the crime and political motivation, not just blanket amnesty. And then the 3rd committee was the committee that the lady is referring to, the Reparations and Rehabilitation Committee. Now, that committee's role came at the end of our work, and they were mandated to give recommendations to the president on how to go about with the issue of reparations. In other words, how to distribute, how to compensate victims, and how to distribute reparations, and what the nature of the reparations would be. And the recommendations were really an amount for everybody who was identified as a victim, found to be a victim by the Truth Commission, and for that amount to be distributed over a period of 6 years to all victims. Now, what happened last year in April, the president's announcement of the decision on this reparations question was that victims would be granted a fixed amount, 30,000, once-off payment of 30,000 South African rand to victims, which was a fraction, a very small fraction of what the Reparations Committee had recommended. Now, this was criticized, highly criticized in South Africa, as not only ignoring the recommendations, but undermining the struggles that the victims had gone through and the pain and suffering that they had gone through, and giving them a pittance, really. And victims themselves were really very angry. People demonstrated and they were upset. They showed their anger. But in terms of what I feel, I think that I too felt very disappointed at the figure, the size of the amount that was granted to victims. But on the other hand, I really thought that the gesture of giving an amount, however small, was important for victims. That it wasn't what we had recommended that it to be, but the gesture of people being given some amount. No amount would bring back victims' loved ones, but still you want at least a respectable amount, even if it's small, even if we accept that it won't bring back their loved ones. But, for some respect and dignity, we had hoped that it would be a little bit more than what was granted, but it wasn't. And the fact that there is an amount, I think, at a symbolic level, that was important.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for speaking here. I would like to see there being more forgiveness in this country. And one of the things that I wonder about relative to that is that so many times I read about horrible crimes in this country. And when the suspect is interviewed, or when the person is finally charged and they're interviewed, they describe their crime in the third person, almost as if another person committed this crime and they watched while another person committed this crime. And I wonder if you can explain how a person can come from seeing their crime in the third person to saying, I did that. I did that, and I must feel the full impact of that.
This is the value of a process such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It forces perpetrators to confront their crimes, to accept accountability, because the focus is on them. They are speaking in the first person. They're not speaking through lawyers. Victims themselves speak about what happened, and they want to see who did it. And so when they're brought as the person who did it, they want to know, how did you do it? Tell me how did you do it? Who sent you to do it? And what happened to my loved one? And why did you do it? And so there is the value of such a process is that it places the victims in the center. They are the focus of the occasion. And they have the voice to speak in whatever way they want about their pain. In a court of law, they are only represented in a document. They are a grieved party. They may not even be called to testify. And so through this language of the courtroom, there is a way of avoiding confronting the events as they happen. There's always the nature of a courtroom is such that people are unable to own their deeds. The language allows them to hide behind the jargon and all sorts of other things, to hide behind lawyers. But here, before the commission, and before a public process, it forces accountability that it cannot be avoided. It's the perpetrator as an individual, they are the ones who are called upon to account. And that is healing for victims. That is where the healing lies. When victims are able to face perpetrators, they did not always know what the value of facing perpetrator was. But once they had the opportunity to face the perpetrators, you could see almost like an immediate sense of relief that something magical has happened. And you ask the people what it was, and they will tell you that I have laid eyes on the person who was the last to see my child or my son. And when they talk to them, they don't ask the questions that the court asks, just the facts. They want to know, did they cry? What were they wearing? Were they in pain? They ask all of these questions. They want to know. It's almost as if you're taking them to be, the conversation with the perpetrator is taking them and bringing them to be with their loved ones at that moment, in their final moments. There's a certain disempowerment when victims are traumatized and their loved ones are taken away so brutally. There's a certain disempowerment that is suffered by the victims, but this re-empowers them because they are the ones who are defining the conversation. They want to know. They know what they want to know. They are giving to the perpetrator. And that is what re-empowers family members of victims. Is that moment of being brought and taken into one of these women, the widows, I refer to in the story of Eugene de Kock, put it in a very clear way. She said, Eugene de Kock enabled us to be with our husbands in life so that we were then able to release them in death and to begin to mourn. So that encounter, that possibility of testifying in the first person is very healing for the perpetrator as well as for the victim, is very healing for the victim. And if courts could at least recognize the power that has, maybe because we cannot do away with courts, but without doing away with that process, but perhaps to incorporate some of these ideas that are very useful in understanding how victims can be assisted to heal.
We'll just take two more questions.
That's fine.
All right, we'll take two more questions. I see someone over here and then someone down here. You first.
You spoke about how important it is that the perpetrator show some remorse, how important that is for the victim or the survivors of the victims. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the process when a perpetrator is not willing or not able to come to that place of remorse or else is dead, and some words of wisdom or comfort for those who are struggling with wanting to forgive the perpetrator but not having that opportunity of closure.
There are ways, symbolic ways of re-establishing some sense of ownership of the process on the part of the victim. The sheer vicarious experience of others encountering perpetrators who are willing to come forward is one way, is a step forward in the healing direction. And some of the victims who came to the commission, in fact, even when they did not meet perpetrators, even if nobody came to confess about the crimes that had happened to them, were committed against them, they found some healing in the story of South Africa, the story that was told by so many victims. There's an identification with other women. Many of the people who came to the commission were women. In fact, the majority were women. But there was an identification with those who had gone through similar experiences. And so through that, victims were able to walk along with people who had already encountered the perpetrators. Now, it was not always so. When perpetrators refused, because it happened as well, that victims would invite perpetrators to dialogue and perpetrators would refuse. When that happens, it tends to re-traumatize the victims, and a much more work needs to be done when that happened. But not all is lost, because at least it's in the framework around that shapes the very language that the victim is dealing with their own story, helps somehow. But there's always that void, that absence, that they did not get to that point of knowing who it is that did it and meeting them face to face. So they tend, when there is refusal, there is a re-traumatization, and that's something that really is, it's hard to control that. But one hopes that when one can work with people who still feel a sense of void, they can be guided to find meaning in other people's stories, and to at least walk with those stories and journey with those stories.
Okay, our final question. Yes.
I just recently moved here from South Africa. I attended high school there.
Oh.
And I know that with my peers, we're all very close racially. There aren't any divisions at all anymore. But that in the older generations, there's still a lot of hatred and a lot of anger. And I'm wondering how you see South Africa in the future. I know just from living there for 3 years that huge developments are made all the time, but there's still so much hatred. How do you see that changing?
There is a lot of work that still has to be done. In fact, you talk about how there is unity in the school that you went to. There is in the what are called open schools or mixed schools. There tends to be much more mixing among young people, which is why young people are so important in these processes of transformation. It's so important to bring together, to teach them, to learn to talk to one another at this early stage. Is very important. But when you go to the townships where there is still a lot of poverty and where some of the young people never had a chance to come before the commission, it was their mothers or their fathers. And in a way, they were not given a voice, even those who were directly affected, whose fathers or mothers or brothers died, were killed in apartheid's war, never had a voice, never really had a space to talk about what it is for them, what it's like for them to be dealing with this trauma. It was the mothers who spoke on their behalf. And it's a little worrying because, I mean, that nothing happened about for the young people is a little worrying. Just because we know psychologically what happens when trauma is not resolved, when there is no space to really deal with one's trauma, when one is not given a voice, particularly among young people. The worry is that they might grow up with a lot of hatred, and I see some of that already. There is a lot of anger among young people, and people don't understand somehow that there are connections, that there are continuities between the violence of the past and the expressions of violence in the present. In fact, if you look at HIV/AIDS as the epidemic that is so serious in South Africa, and consider the behavior of many young people, which we can call reckless behavior that doesn't care for protective measures in sexual behavior, I tend to look at that as some kind of fatalistic existence, as a kind of sense of foreshortened future, that there was so much pain in the past. This other pain of AIDS, HIV, is yet another pain, is another trauma, and laying over the trauma that was not dealt with. And so in living recklessly, young people are really saying, what's the point of protecting our lives? I mean, you tell us about condom use and about watching how we behave. What's the point? You know, our lives are meaningless, they are worthless. What's the point of protecting a life that is worthless? There may not be a concerted reasoning around those issues, but I think at a profoundly psychological level, there is that element, the element of, you know, just giving up on themselves and continuing behaving recklessly and spreading the disease, not caring whether they catch AIDS or not. It's very complicated. I mean, there are many other issues related to this, but I think one has to consider the possibility of violence at the level of young people if they are not brought into some kind of dialogue about what happened in the past to their families.
Good. Pumla, you've spoken to our minds and also to our hearts, and we thank you.
Thank
from
you
the depths
very,
of our
very
being.
much. Thank you, I appreciate it.
And thank you for all coming.